Huh? You just hit 3 seconds ago. What?
All right, I believe we're on page 707. Put that up on the screen here. That's the next page here. The very bottom, looks like something's being sent here. What's that?
Candace is sending a video on 12/29/2017.
And what's the last 3 for identification purposes of that video?
114.
Move for the admission of 109, People's 109.
No objection.
Another video sent back on 707 right after that video. What's the date on that?
12/29/2017, and it's going to be sent roughly 30 seconds later.
Okay, and what's the last 3 of the video for identification purposes?
765.
People move for People's Exhibit 110 into evidence.
No objection.
Or receive it.
And we'll leave to the last page here, 702. What's the date on this?
The date on the page is 1/1/18. When you do the translation of the UTC, you're going to be looking at 12/31/2017 at approximately 6:05 in the evening. It is sent by Brad Fields, and he said, cold bath again, piston underwear and floor. And then Candace responds, BC, because I left, question mark, and Brad responds, I don't know, and then Brad responds, had her whole pee, they wet in spot on floor too. Candace responds, what the fuck? Brad responds, 2 days now, not used toilet at fucking all. Candace responds, then make her stay on toilet like when we trained her. And Brad responds, then she'll just sleep bad. And Candace responds, on 1/1/18, there is a new message sent from Candace at 12:31 in the afternoon, call me.
And that concludes the messages between Candace Fields and Brad Diaz on Facebook.
That is correct.
That last message sent here, this is still with that Brad Fields account ending in 206. Would you agree with that?
Yes, sir.
And did you have the opportunity, I know we already discussed that to some length, did you have the opportunity to review all of those Facebook records for Brad Fields' account ending 206? That is, for the record, People's Exhibit 116.
I did review them.
And all these Facebook messages that we reviewed on Friday and continued here this morning, whose Facebook records did you find those on?
Candace.
And did you find those same records on defendant Fields' Facebook account?
No.
And the preservation letters you sent out for those accounts, were those sent out on the same day?
No.
When did you send out the preservation letters, if you remember, for the Brad Fields and Candace Diaz Facebook account?
Candace was sent out in January, and the 206 account for Brad was sent out, I believe, in March. I don't recall the exact date.
All right, I'd like to show you what's been previously marked as People's 144.
Yes, sir.
You recognize that?
I do.
Okay, so let me show defense counsel here while I'm at it. I'll hand this back to you.
Thank you, sir.
And what did I just hand you a photograph of?
This is a photograph of Zoe, Candace, and Brad, and it says Happy New Year. It was posted on 1/1/2018 at roughly midnight, 17 seconds after. And the post says, Happy New Year from Zoe.
Move for the admission of People's 144.
No objection.
Or received.
There's the photograph. Down here is the post,
Correct.
and that's where you're reading where it says Happy New Year's from Zoe.
Yes, sir.
And the photograph has, I suppose the jury can see that for themselves, 3 individuals in it.
Correct.
So at this point, I have no further questions for Sergeant Eager.
Cross-examination.
Thank you.
Mr. Rather, would you like me to turn that projector off?
I can manage this.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning. Thank you. Now, part of your job, or one of the main responsibilities you had was to get search warrants to get all of these Facebook messages, correct?
The technology, yes.
Give me 1 second. I apologize.
The microphone. Oh.
Right there. I'm sorry, if you could find it.
Yes, the technology search warrants.
Okay. And the when you were watching the videos that were being shown, specifically People's Exhibit number 98 and People's Exhibit 108, you could hear a voice in the background of someone you couldn't see on camera. Is that correct?
Yes.
Did you recognize that voice?
Yes.
Whose voice was that?
That was Candace Diaz.
Okay. And with the text messages that were received that you were reading from Friday and today, do you know in total how many pages of text messages there were?
There were over 300.
Over 300?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and that's the total messages that were received. That's what I'm asking. Do you know the total?
So the actual message itself sent, or the pages
The
sent?
pages, the number of pages total for all of the messages you received.
So the messages that I reviewed for this particular case that we talked about Friday and today were between Candace Diaz and Brad.
Correct.
And there was roughly over 300 pages total.
And do you recall approximately how many of those pages you read through between Friday and today?
71?
And other than the messages that you have actually read through Friday and today, there are other messages between Candace and other people, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, very well. And there's other messages between Brad Fields and other people, is that also correct?
Yes, sir. We talked about them.
Thank you very much. I have no further questions.
Redirect.
No, Your Honor.
Step down.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Let's stand up and take a throat spray. Next witness.
Heather Vitta.
You may be seated. Raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear affirm testimony you're about to give this man the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God? Yes, I do. Please be seated. You may proceed, Counselor Long.
Thank you, Judge. Good morning. Can you state your name for the record?
My name is Heather. The last name is Vitta, V as in Victor, I-T-T-A.
And what do you do for a living?
I am a laboratory manager.
Can you sit back and just pull that mic
Yeah.
just a little closer because your voice is going up and down.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
I am a laboratory manager for the Michigan State Police at the Northville Crime Lab in the Biology and DNA unit.
You said you work in the biology and DNA unit?
That's correct.
What exactly do you do for the Michigan State Police at that Northville laboratory?
Well, I manage a team of scientists who conduct casework analysis on evidence samples that are brought to the laboratory. And when I say casework analysis, we're looking for sources of DNA, typically body fluid identifications, and comparisons to known reference samples from different people of interest.
So you do work with DNA and trying to identify those, a known person to that DNA?
Correct. So comparisons are made to DNA profiles that are developed from evidence samples.
All right. How long have you been at the Michigan State Police?
I've been with the Michigan State Police almost 24 years.
And have you been in the same field of work those entire 24 years?
Yes, that's correct, in biology and DNA analysis.
Did you work in that field at a different location prior to the Michigan State Police?
Briefly, I worked in that area of forensic biology and DNA for the Detroit Police Department in their crime laboratory.
How long were you at the Detroit Police Department?
I was with them over 7 years, but most of my work was as a drug chemist, analyzing different suspected items of drugs.
Let's talk about what sort of education you have that allows you to become a DNA analyst.
I have a Bachelor's of Science degree in criminalistics or forensic science from Michigan State University. In addition, I've taken coursework at Wayne State University in molecular biology, genetics, and other topics that pertain to forensic DNA analysis.
Do you know how many additional courses you've taken post-bachelor's?
I've taken probably 5 or 6 courses post-bachelor.
All right. Do you have any specialized training when you were at the Detroit Police Department as to being a DNA or biology analysis?
Yes, in 1990 I was sent to the FBI Academy where I attended a month-long course. It was both lecture and laboratory course on forensic DNA analysis. And I was invited to extend my stay as a visiting scientist where I conducted DNA research in the laboratories at Quantico, Virginia.
How long was that extended stay for?
It was 6 months total between the course and the visiting scientist.
Any objection to stipulating to her as a witness, as an expert in the area of DNA analysis?
No, so stipulate, Your Honor.
Okay, very good. And that means that she's allowed to testify as an expert in the area of DNA analysis. But as I indicated to you before, and it's a standing instruction, you are the judges of the facts. You can decide what, if any, value any expert has. You may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. when you go about analyzing two or multiple specimens for comparison, what's the first thing you do?
Well, the first thing that we do is that the evidence is submitted to the laboratory, and typically evidence samples may come in with or without reference samples for comparison. But it's locked in a vault, a sealed property room that has limited access. And then at which time that case becomes assigned to a scientist to actually perform the DNA analysis. It will be removed from the vault and inventoried as to what items were submitted forward for DNA analysis. So that's all documented on various worksheets. And the DNA analysis is actually removing the DNA from the biological material. So DNA is contained within certain cells in our bodies, and we have to actually break open the cells to release the DNA. So that's the DNA isolation step. Then there's another step where we quantitate or determine how much DNA is present in the sample. And that step is necessary for the following steps, where we actually conduct the Pcr process, which stands for polymerase chain reaction. It allows us to make many, many copies of small amounts of DNA. And so the method is very sensitive. We utilize an instrument called a genetic analyzer to separate out the DNA types that we see. And we can use a number classification scheme. So if I have a reference sample, we can develop a DNA profile for that particular person that can then be used to compare against the DNA types that are obtained from an evidence sample.
All right, so you explained several steps there. I just want to go through them really briefly. You said the first step, and we'll take this as you have specimen A, just a random thing. The first step that you or somebody in your office would do is go through that isolation step.
That's correct. It's the isolation or extraction step.
And the purpose of that is to get the DNA out of the cells?
Correct. So the DNA is contained within a nucleus inside the cell, and we have to break open the cell to release the DNA and collect it.
Is that necessary in your process to be able to use that DNA for analysis?
Yes, it is.
All right. And after you've done that, you said the next step is to quantitate it?
Correct. It just simply means we have to determine how much human DNA we actually were able to obtain from the extraction of that sample.
And how do you go about that process?
Well, most of the steps involving DNA analysis are addition of certain chemicals and different reagents to the DNA in order to visualize how much DNA we have present. And so this particular step involves the use of an instrument that allows us to measure how much human DNA is present.
So it sounds like this step is just to ensure that there's enough DNA to do further testing on it?
Correct, and also to optimize how much DNA is actually put in subsequent reactions.
And then you said the next step is a PCR process. What's the purpose of the PCR process?
Well, the Pcr process, or polymerase chain reaction, allows us to make millions of copies of the DNA of interest. So we can utilize very small DNA samples and still get results because we use this amplification process.
How accurate is that process?
It's very accurate. We run what we call controls at the same time during that amplification. So we have a positive control where we have a known result that we should get, and we have a negative control that we shouldn't get a result from. And so we measure the quality of the reaction throughout the process.
The quality of that reaction, would that have been done in this case as well?
Yes, it's done in every case.
All right. And then you said the next step was the genetic analyzer?
Yes, so once the sample has become amplified, a small amount of that sample is then put into a little tube, and it's sampled by an instrument that can separate the DNA based upon the various lengths of fragments that are present in the sample. It can then compare it against other standards that are run at the same time on that instrument and then classify the DNA types that are observed with a numbering system.
Is that the point where if there were multiple sources of DNA, that this process would determine how many sources of DNA there are?
No, when we're looking at determining how many contributors are present in say a mixture of DNA from an evidence sample, that's an interpretation that's done by a trained analyst like myself.
Okay, all right. And then you said that the next point is the reference point?
Well, I think I said that we could then take those results from the genetic analyzer, from the evidence sample, and then compare it to reference samples.
All right, so you put, after you've done those initial processes after the PCR process, you're putting, you said, that little tube into the genetic analyzer, and you're getting some information back at that point?
That's correct.
And do you do that with all of the specimens of DNA that you're testing, the known samples and the unknown samples?
Yes.
And then at that point, it's the job of an analyst such as yourself to compare those, to make any sort of comparisons?
Correct. So it's the job of an analyst to interpret the results and determine if additional software or tools may be needed to interpret more complex results.
And what sort of, well, I guess I'll narrow it down. How many different software tools generally would you have for comparing DNA?
Well, we use software throughout the process, not only the quantitation step, but also when we run the samples on the genetic analyzer. But then there's also a software program that can be used to help interpret more complex mixtures, and that tool is called STR Mix. Sometimes you'll hear it called Star Mix. And that's just another software tool that helps us, again, with interpreting more complex mixtures of typically anything more than 2 or 3 people can sometimes become complex.
How long have you been using the STR Mix software?
We obtained the software back around 2015, and we all received training from the software developers on the use of the software.
And did you receive that training?
Yes, I did.
As it relates to this case and this analysis, did you use that STR Mix software?
Yes, I did.
Excuse me.
And all of the processes that were gone prior to this, were those processes would have been the same process that these samples that you are about to testify about, would they have gone through those same processes?
Yes.
All right. Would you and did you perform analysis on several items as it relates to this matter, being laboratory number SH18-1?
Yes, I did.
And did you put all of those inside, prepare them into a report?
Yes, I did.
All right, I'm going to show you what's been previously been marked, People's Exhibit 93. You can take a look at that really quick.
Can't get the pages apart, sorry. Yes.
Is that your report in totality?
Yes, it is.
It's like it's a 7-page document, proposed People's 93, move for the admission of People's 93.
No objection.
Thank you, Your Honor. Do you have a copy of this report?
Yes, I do.
All right, I'd like to direct your attention first to SH18-1-2AD, that's on that first page. And that has a Bradfield buccal swab collected next to it. Did you do anything as it relates to that?
That sample represents a reference sample from Bradfield's. A buccal swab is simply a swabbing of the inside cheek area for collecting those cells that would contain DNA, and that represents his reference sample. So yes, a DNA profile was developed from that sample.
And you would have used this as a known person's DNA?
Correct. It is a known DNA profile.
All right. And as it relates to, I'll just refer to the last three when necessary. 3AD, it says a Candace Diaz buccal sample. Did you do the same process as it relates to that one?
Yes, that's correct.
And were you able to obtain a known DNA profile for Candace Diaz?
Yes.
And I want to move to 6AD. That's also a buccal swab for Gabrielle Barrett. Did you do the same process for her?
Yes.
And were you able to obtain a known DNA sample from her?
Yes.
All right. I want to move to, let's see what page this is on. It's going to be interpretation number 4 under your conclusions on page 2. Did you receive a sample for an L9D children's bedroom wall swab?
Yes.
Did you process that, and were you able to obtain a DNA sample from that?
Yes, a DNA profile was obtained from the stain from the wall, and I determined that this sample was consistent with a single person or single contributor, and so a comparison was made to the various reference samples that were submitted in this case.
How do you go about determining whether or not a sample has more than one or more than one contributor?
Well, DNA is inherited from our mom and dad, and we get half of our DNA from mom and half from dad. And so that usually results in DNA type from mom that sometimes can be different from the DNA type that you obtain from your dad. So we look at up to 24 different locations on the DNA strand, and at each one of those locations for a single source or a single contributor sample, one would expect to see either 1 or 2 DNA types. That's all one would expect to see for a single source person for most situations.
Were you able to determine how many contributors there were to that L9D sample?
That sample was consistent with a single individual or one person.
Now, after you've obtained or you've come to the conclusion that there's one person, proposed one person for that sample, what's the next step in your process?
Well, the next step is to do comparisons to the reference samples that are also submitted in the particular case. So in this situation, because I was using the StarMix software for the interpretation of mixtures that were obtained on other samples, I also used that software for the comparison, even though this was a single source sample. And so when I do those comparisons using the StarMix software, the conclusions are formed in the form of a likelihood ratio. So what I'm telling you is how likely it is that a particular person is a contributor to the DNA types that were observed in the evidence sample. A simple example of a likelihood ratio is if the weatherman says, based upon the radar data, there's an 80% chance that it's going to rain today. That means the opposing view would be that there's a 20% chance that it's not going to rain today. So 80 divided by 20 is 4. So it's 4 times more likely that it's going to rain than not rain. And so that is how I propose my conclusions when it comes to the comparisons.
I also see in your report portion that says there's a section for hypotheses. Can you explain that?
Again, that's those opposing viewpoints. So remember I gave the weather example. It's going to rain today based upon the radar data, or it's not going to rain today based upon the radar data. So a hypothesis is just 2 opposing views, and we're doing a comparison of those 2 opposing statements.
Okay. So you're looking at one and then trying to determine if there's evidence to support it's going to rain versus it's not going to rain?
Correct.
All right. And then in the conclusion portion, what do you usually place in that portion? Not necessarily this exact one.
Usually there's a numerical value that is the actual likelihood ratio of how many times more likely it is that a person is a contributor or is not a contributor to the particular evidence sample.
I also see a section under there called verbal scale. What sort of material do you put in that portion?
The verbal scale is given so that you have some sort of idea of what the numerical value means. So it's just putting it in words. And so we give both the numerical value for the likelihood ratio as well as a strength of that association.
All right. And then I see in this particular set, it also has exclusions. Can you just explain what material would be placed in that box?
So an exclusion is when a person is not a contributor or is not a source of the DNA. That means they cannot be the person that deposited their DNA in that body fluid stain.
So in this case, you had multiple known DNA samples.
That's correct.
So for every sample, you would not only try to figure out whose DNA was likely there, but also whose DNA was not likely there?
Correct.
All right. Now let's look particularly at conclusion 4. That's for L9D. That's for that children's bedroom wall stain swab. Were you able to reach a conclusion as it related to that sample?
Yes. So I proposed two different hypotheses. One, that it was consistent with Gabrielle Barrett, or the second hypothesis was that it was an unrelated, unknown contributor. So it is Gabrielle Barrett versus it's somebody else other than Gabrielle Barrett. Those are the two hypotheses.
And were you able to come to a conclusion based upon those hypotheses?
Yes. So based upon the DNA typing results from the children's bedroom wall stain, it was 7.5 septillion times more likely that the DNA originated from Gabrielle Barrett than an unrelated, unknown contributor.
Okay, and that word 7.5 septillion, that's not in common vernacular. How many, let's put it this way, how many zeros are in a billion?
In a billion, there are 9.
Okay, and how many, for reference, are you familiar with how many people there are living on the planet Earth?
There is approximately 7.5 billion people on planet Earth right now for comparison purposes.
All right, and how many zeros does septillion have in it?
A septillion has 24 zeros. So 7.4 septillion times more likely means that it far exceeds what we would consider the population of the world. But we're not looking at it in terms of how many people in the world could contribute. We're looking at how likely it is that the DNA types that were detected, are consistent with Gabrielle Barrett, and how many times more likely we would expect Gabrielle Barrett to be the source of the DNA.
All right. And under the verbal scale, this is the part where you say you verbalize it, not you use a numeric statement. What's your verbal scale relate as it to conclusion number 4?
That it's very strong support that Gabrielle Barrett is the contributor to the DNA types that were detected from the wall stain.
I'd like to move on to conclusion number 5, which is right below it on the same page 2. This is for lab number 17D. That's a hair swab that was taken. Were you able to get a DNA sample from that swab?
Yes, the DNA profile was developed from the hair stain swab, and it was consistent with a single contributor, one person. And so I formulated the same hypotheses. The first hypothesis was that Gabrielle Barrett was a contributor. The second was that it was not Gabrielle Barrett, it's an unrelated, unknown contributor. And so then I did my comparison, and it was at least 10 septillion times more likely that Gabrielle Barrett was the contributor to this sample.
All right. Were you able to make any exclusions as it relates to the hair?
Yes, for both samples, the wall stain as well as the hair stain, Brad Fields and Candace Diaz were excluded as possible sources of those stains.
That was both for the item number 6 that we previously talked about and the hair sample item number 17?
That's correct.
All right. Let's move on to your next conclusion point. That's on number 6. In your conclusion, that's for L19A1D, described as a blue glove A outside stain swab, were you able to create a DNA profile for that swab?
Yes.
And how many contributors did you have?
Again, it was a single contributor, one person.
All right. And did you form a hypothesis?
Again, that it was consistent with Gabrielle Barrett, or it was an unknown, unrelated individual. So H1, hypothesis 1, was that it's Gabrielle Barrett. H2, hypothesis 2, is that it's not Gabrielle Barrett.
And were you able to reach any conclusions on your hypotheses?
Yes, it was 5.9 septillion times more likely that the DNA originated from Gabrielle Barrett.
Were you able to make any exclusions as it relates to the outside swab on Blue Glove A?
Yes, Brad Fields and Candace Diaz were both excluded as a source of the DNA from the stain on the outside of the glove.
Now I'd like to move to conclusion number 7 in your report. That is L19A2D with description as Blue Glove A, same glove inside swab. Were you able to create a DNA profile from that sample?
Yes, a DNA profile was created from that sample.
Okay. And were you able to determine how many contributors there were to that sample?
For that sample, there were 3 contributors. That is, 3 different people contributed DNA to what was obtained from that sample.
All right. And I noticed that since there's 3 contributors here, you made at least 3 hypotheses as to whose it would be?
Well, I made 2 hypotheses for each comparison with a reference sample. Okay, so there's always 2. You know, it's either consistent with a certain person, or it's not consistent with that person.
All right. So let's start with your first set of blocks there. Your first hypotheses, your 2 hypotheses for that first block were?
That it was consistent with Gabrielle Barrett and 2 unrelated unknown contributors. So 3 people total, including Gabrielle Barrett. Or that it's just 3 unknown, unrelated contributors.
All right. And were you able to make a conclusion to that hypothesis that you made there?
Yes, it was 1.6 septillion times more likely that the DNA originated from Gabrielle Barrett and 2 unknown, unrelated individuals than if it originated from 3 unknown, unrelated individuals.
Okay. And verbally, you would describe that as very strong support that it was her DNA?
That's correct.
All right. Did you form a second set of hypotheses as it related to this sample?
Yes, the second set was Brad Fields and 2 unrelated unknown contributors, or again, 3 unrelated unknown contributors. And so at this point, I was then comparing to Mr. Fields' DNA profile.
And were you able to reach a conclusion as to that?
Yes, it was 2.2 billion times more likely if the DNA originated from Brad Fields and 2 unrelated unknown contributors than if it originated from 3 unknown, unrelated contributors.
Okay. And how would you verbalize your support of that, those numbers?
It's very strong support that Brad Fields is a contributor to the DNA profile that was developed from the Blue Glove A inside swabs.
All right. I see you made a third hypothesis here as it relates to Ms. Diaz. What are your hypotheses on this one?
This was that it was consistent with Candace Diaz and 2 unrelated unknown contributors, or again, 3 unknown unrelated contributors. And so based upon the DNA types observed from Blue Glove A inside swabs, it was at least 3,100 times more likely if the DNA originated from Candace Diaz.
All right. And how would you verbalize that finding that you had there?
This is strong support that Candace Diaz is a contributor to the Blue Glove A inside swabs.
All right. So Candace Diaz was 3,100 times more likely to be a contributor,
That's correct.
and Brad Fields was 2.2 billion times more likely to be a contributor,
That's correct.
and Gabrielle Barrett was 1.6 septillion times more likely to be a contributor.
That's correct.
All right. I want to move on to interpretation number 9, conclusion number 9, or 8, my apologies, skipped one. That's for L19B1D, that's described as Blue Glove B, the outside stain swab, were you able to develop a DNA profile for this sample?
Yes, and it was consistent with a single contributor or a single person.
All right, and did you make any hypotheses as to whose DNA was on the outside of that blue glove?
Yes, the first hypothesis was that it was consistent with Gabrielle Barrett, or the second would be that it would be an unrelated, unknown individual.
And were you able to make any conclusions onto those hypotheses?
Yes. It was 9.5 septillion times more likely that the DNA originated from Gabrielle Barrett than an unrelated, unknown individual.
And how would you verbalize that?
Again, that's very strong support that she is a contributor to the outside of Blue Glove.
Were you able to make any exclusion as it relates to DNA on the outside?
Yes, Brad Fields and Candace Diaz were both excluded as a source of the DNA on the outside of Blue Glove B, outside stain swab.
Let's move on to conclusion number 9. That's L19B2D, described as Blue Glove B inside swab. Were you able to develop a DNA profile from the inside swab of that same blue glove?
Yes, a profile was developed and it was consistent with 3 contributors.
Is this the same situation in terms of forming hypotheses as the last time we had 3 contributors?
Yes, that's correct.
All right.
So I'm going to make comparisons against the various reference samples.
What was your first set of hypotheses as it relates to this?
That it was consistent with Gabrielle Barrett and 2 unrelated unknown contributors, or that it was just simply 3 unknown unrelated contributors.
And were you able to reach a conclusion as to these hypotheses?
Yes. It was 660 sextillion times more likely if the DNA originated from Gabrielle Barrett and 2 additional unknown unrelated contributors than if it originated from 3 unknown unrelated contributors.
All right, this time you used the number sextillion, correct?
Correct.
And that's different than the previous septillion.
Yes, it's actually a smaller number. It's only 21 zeros instead of 24.
And how would you verbalize your support for that finding?
Again, this would be very strong support that Gabrielle Barrett is a contributor to this glove sample, the blue glove B inside swab.
All right. Now you tested another high set of hypotheses as to these 3 contributors.
Yes.
Your second one was?
Comparing Brad Fields and 2 unknown unrelated contributors, or 3 unknown unrelated contributors. And it was 640 million times more likely that the DNA originated from Brad Fields and 2 unknown unrelated contributors than 3 unknown unrelated contributors.
All right. And how would you verbalize your support on that finding?
Again, this would be very strong support that Brad Fields is a contributor to the DNA that was detected from the Blue Glove B inside swabs.
And you posed a third set of hypotheticals as it relates. What was your hypotheses for that third set?
Comparing Candace Diaz, and so my first hypothesis was that it's consistent with Candace Diaz and 2 unrelated unknown individuals, or 3 unknown unrelated individuals. And the results were that it was 7.7 times more likely if the DNA originated from Candace Diaz and 2 unrelated unknown contributors than if the DNA originated from 3 unrelated unknown contributors. Basically, this is a very low number, so it makes this comparison what we would call, in a verbal scale, uninformative. It's not helpful. It's not giving us any information about whether or not she's a contributor to this particular sample.
All right. So as it relates to Candace Diaz, you're not really able to reach any conclusions whether or not her DNA was on there?
Just that it's very uninformative and it's a reflection of potentially how much DNA is present.
But Mr. Fields had 640 million times more likely his DNA was present.
That's correct.
And Gabrielle Barrett's was 660 sextillion times more likely.
That's correct.
I'm going to move on to what's under conclusion number 10. That would be the interpretation of item L19CD, which has been described as Blue Glove's C inside swab for DNA. Were you able to develop a DNA profile for this swab?
Yes, the profile that was developed was consistent with 3 contributors, or 3 different people.
And did you form hypotheses as it related to that?
Yes, the first comparison was whether or not Gabrielle Barrett was included along with 2 unrelated unknown contributors, or was this consistent with 3 unknown unrelated contributors.
Okay, and as it relates to that hypothesis, were you able to reach any conclusions?
Yes, it was 140 trillion times more likely that Gabrielle Barrett was a contributor along with 2 unrelated unknown contributors to this sample.
And how would you verbalize that support?
Very strong support, again, that she is a contributor to the profile that was developed from blue glove C inside swabs.
As it relates to the other hypotheses that you posed, what were the hypotheses on this one?
The second set of hypotheses was Candace Diaz and 2 unrelated unknown contributors, or 3 unknown unrelated contributors. So that comparison was made with Ms. Diaz, and it was 2.5 quintillion times more likely that the DNA originated from Candace Diaz and 2 unknown unrelated contributors.
In quintillion, that's a new set of numbers. How many zeros on that?
It's again a smaller number, but it's still 18 zeros.
All right. Were you able to make any exclusions as it relates to blue glove C inside swabs?
Brad Fields was excluded as a contributor to blue glove C inside swabs.
All right. Now I want to move on to, you have some black gloves here as well. I want to ask you about line item 11. Were you able to, and that's described as L19D1D black gloves, or black glove single, my apologies, D outside stain swab. Were you able to develop a DNA profile for that glove?
DNA profile was developed for that glove, but it was consistent with more than just 4 contributors, and so at that point we cannot make any conclusions because it has become too complex even for the software to be able to determine who's a possible contributor to that mixture.
All right, and that was for line item number 11, or conclusion 11. What about conclusion 12? That's the inside of that black glove. Were you able to reach a DNA profile for that one?
Yes, again, a DNA profile was developed. It was consistent with 4 contributors, and I still was able to use the STR mix software to help interpret that mixture and make comparisons.
All right, what was your first hypothesis as it relates to that black glove inside swab?
Whether or not it was consistent with Gabrielle Barrett and 3 unrelated unknown contributors, or just 4 unrelated unknown contributors.
And were you able to make a conclusion?
Yes, it was 14 million times more likely that it was consistent with Gabrielle Barrett and 3 unrelated unknown contributors.
And how would you verbalize that support finding?
Very strong support that Gabrielle Barrett was a contributor to the mixture of DNA types that was developed from the black glove D inside swabs.
All right, did you make another set of hypotheses as it relates to Mr. Fields?
Yes, I did. So Brad Fields and 3 unrelated unknown contributors, or 4 unknown unrelated contributors. And it was at least 100 billion times more likely that the DNA originated for Brad Fields and 3 unrelated unknown contributors.
And how would you verbalize that?
Very strong support that Brad Fields is a contributor to the DNA profile developed from the black glove D inside swabs.
All right, were you able to form some hypotheses as it relates to Candace Diaz on this same black glove?
Yes. So I formulated hypothesis 1 that it was Candace Diaz along with 3 unknown unrelated contributors, or 4 unknown unrelated contributors. And based upon the DNA results, it was at least 720 octillion times more likely if the DNA originated from 4 unrelated unknown contributors than if it originated from Candace Diaz and 3 unknown unrelated.
All right, and octillion, that's a new number. How many
Yes.
zeros there?
Boy, I didn't. offhand, I don't recall, but it's less than septillion, so,
It's less than septillion?
yeah.
Is it more than a billion?
Yes, it's more than a billion.
All right, and I noticed we have 3 strong support, very strong supports, and you said there was 4 contributors, so there's a 4th unknown, unrelated DNA sample there?
Correct. So there's very strong support that Candace Diaz was not a contributor to the black glove D inside swabs.
Okay, so Candace Diaz was basically excluded?
Correct.
All right. Now I'd like to move on to line item 19, I'm looking right at it, 13. That's for LDL20D, described as possible tissue skin, a DNA cutting. Were you able to develop a DNA profile as it relates to that sample?
Yes, the DNA profile that was developed was consistent with a single contributor or a single person.
And were you able to form any hypotheses as to that?
Yes, so the first hypothesis was that it was consistent with Gabrielle Barrett. The second was that it was an unrelated unknown contributor.
And were you able to form a conclusion as it relates to those hypotheses?
Yes, 5.8 septillion times more likely that it was consistent with Gabrielle Barrett than an unrelated unknown contributor.
And we're back to septillion, that's the 24 zeros?
Correct.
All right, were you able to verbalize how that support would be?
This would, again, be very strong support that Gabrielle Barrett is the contributor to the possible skin or tissue that was taken.
Okay, were you able to exclude anybody?
Brad Fields and Candace Diaz were excluded as a source of the possible skin or tissue.
All right. And I see that that seems to be all the samples that you tested on this case?
That's correct.
Your processes that you've gone through, have these been tested to know how accurate this is?
Yes, every method in the crime laboratory is fully validated before it's ever put to use on actual casework samples. And so we have to do different studies to ensure that we're getting the correct results and that the process is working correctly on evidence samples. So it involves a lot of studies and research, and that is done for not just the use of software, but for actual analytical methods too in the laboratory.
And are you able to verbalize how accurate this STR testing interpretation makes it?
I can't verbalize how accurate it is. It's obviously dependent on humans determining how many contributors are present in a particular sample. It's a software tool, so it's directly a reflection of the training and skills of the scientists using that particular software.
I must ask, report reporter, I did move into evidence Exhibit 93 of the report, is that correct? Okay, thank you. I have no further questions.
Cross-examination.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
Now, the report that you have provided, that reflects your interpretation of the DNA analysis, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so you're not the one who does the actual DNA analysis, someone else does that, right?
In this particular case, that's correct. I did not do the analytical steps, but I have obviously done the analytical steps over many years.
I understand, but in this particular case, it was an interpretation of what
Correct.
somebody else did.
That's correct.
And who did that actual analysis? Do you know?
Forensic scientist Erica Anderson.
Okay, and you work out of the Northville lab?
That's correct.
Does scientist Anderson also work out of the same lab?
Yes, she does.
Okay. And the evidence that you had received, part of your interpretation, you're comparing the evidence with the reference samples you have, correct?
Correct.
Okay, and the reference samples we're talking about are, in this case, the buccal swabs, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so you had a buccal swab from Brad Fields, correct?
Yes,
You had a buccal swab from Ken Steves, right?
yes,
You had a buccal swab from Gabby Barrett, correct?
correct.
And then you had I believe you had 2 buccal swabs from someone else named Jerry Baca, B-A-K-K-A, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And in this report, after you've listed the reference samples, the buccal swabs, well, let me re-ask this. There's about 15 under the section of evidence. There's about 15 items, correct?
I think there were 11 items total,
Okay, 11 items total. If I'm
plus the reference samples.
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, that's what I was getting at. Thank you
Yes.
for clearing that up. Now, one of the pieces of evidence you have was a swab. That was a DNA cutting that was purported to be from a child's room, correct? That's
From a child, yes, children's bedroom wall stain.
very well. And one was from what is just listed as hair and then in parentheses stain.
Correct, it was apparent blood on hair.
Very well, like a sample of hair. Did you have that sample of hair?
I think it was swabbed by the other scientist
Very well.
to remove the staining from the hair.
Okay, so you had the swab, you didn't have the piece of hair, correct?
Correct,
Okay. And then some of the evidence you had different types of gloves, correct?
correct.
You had sets of blue gloves, is that right?
Yes, there were blue gloves and black
And
gloves.
then there were black gloves, correct? Okay.
Yes,
And finally, you had some sort of tissue, possibly skin, is that correct?
yes, apparent skin or tissue.
Very well. And these evidence samples that you have that where you are doing the interpretation, do you know who collected those?
I believe that Miranda Irwin collected many of those samples. I can't say for sure that she collected all of them.
Very well. And do you know what location or where those samples came from?
I do not know the address. I just know that it was the home of Gabrielle Barrett.
Okay. And the other than scientist Irwin, who you mentioned, collecting the evidence, would you have any knowledge of any other people who handled or collected any of that evidence?
Not offhand. I know that there were other individuals that responded to the crime scene. So there are other scientists or employees of the Michigan State Police that went to that crime scene.
Okay, because there's like a team that goes there, correct?
Correct.
Okay. But there were also, would have been police officers there, correct?
I'm assuming so, yes.
Okay. And the samples that you use, the evidence samples that you use, do you retain each of those samples once you have interpreted the DNA analysis?
Swabs are taken of the items, and typically we don't consume the entire sample. A part of that sample or swab that's taken is preserved.
Very well. And that's preserved where? At the lab?
Initially, it's preserved at the lab in a secure vault area, but eventually it's returned to the submitting agency.
Very well. But items can be consumed when tested, correct?
Yes, sometimes we do have to consume all of the item in order to obtain the best opportunity to get a DNA result.
It's your testimony that none of the items were consumed at this point during this analysis, is that correct?
I don't believe that any of these items were consumed, but I'm not entirely 100% certain.
Okay, so you're not totally sure, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And if they're consumed, then they can't be tested again, is that correct?
Correct. So if the entire swab that was taken from a glove is used in the DNA analysis, then there would be no swab remaining. There would be the original glove that could be re-swabbed if need be to obtain possible more DNA.
But not the cutting that was originally.
Not the particular cutting that's referenced in my report.
Very well, thank you very much. And when you were interpreting the DNA, you made several conclusions, and you and the prosecutor went through those, so I don't want to rehash it all. But you did find your conclusions were you found what was DNA from each Brad Fields, Candace Diaz, and Gabby Barrett in your analysis, correct?
Correct.
And this was from from what you know of this investigation, this was from the home in which they live, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And if I remember correctly, there was one glove, I believe it was a black glove. I'm looking at page 5 of your laboratory report under line 11. You see that part, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And that was a black glove, right?
Correct.
And there was no comparison that you could be made from the DNA reference samples you had, correct?
Correct. Once the number of contributors exceeds 4, then we cannot use the software or reliably make interpretations using the STR-Mix software.
The two sets of gloves, the blue and the black gloves, were they all the same material?
I don't know the answer to that question.
Very well, thank you. I have no further questions.
Redirect.
I do have one question. I forgot to ask you to direct. The defense counsel brought it up. You had a sample for Jerry Vitta as well?
Correct.
And that source's DNA was tested on almost all of these items, correct?
Correct. The same hypothesis was created for Mr. Baca.
And never once was his DNA found or likely to be found on any of these items?
Correct. He was excluded.
All right.
Step down. Let's take a stretch break. Next witness. Raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear affirm testimony you're about to give this now, the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth will help you God. Please be seated. State your name on the record. Just sit back like you at the movies and turn toward the judges of the back so they can see. Excuse me, Deputy, can I get assistance? Can I get assistance? Thank you. You turn toward the judges. That's them.
The judges.
Okay, yeah. I'm the judge, they the judges. Okay, very good. Thank you so very much.
Deborah Laurain.
Can you spell that?
Spell your first and last.
Deborah, D-E-B-R-A, Laurain, L-A-U-R-A-I-N.
How are you doing this morning, Ms. Lorraine?
Okay.
All right. And what is your occupation?
I'm a paraprofessional, aka co-teacher.
A what?
Co-teacher?
A co-teacher. I thought you said a co-teacher, okay.
Are you like an assistant to a
Yes,
teacher in a
as
courtroom?
teacher's assistant.
All right. And how long have you been doing that for?
15 years.
And where do you teach at currently?
Model Elementary,
And where is that part of a school district?
Lincoln Consolidated School District.
And what cities does that school district service?
Ypsilanti, some of Belleville, Augusta.
Are you familiar, well, I suppose I'll ask, you said that you're an aide. Who's the teacher in that courtroom?
Teresa Schillenberg.
And, oh, my apologies. Classroom, not courtroom.
I didn't even catch it.
I didn't either. Go ahead.
My associate did. And you said Teresa, can you just go ahead and spell her name for the court reporter?
Teresa, T-H-E-R-E-S-A, I believe. Schillenberg, S-C-H-U-L-E-N-B-U-R-G. Don't quote me on that.
All right. And how long have you and Ms. Schulenberg been together?
This will be our third year starting.
And what grade do you teach?
Preschool, GSRP.
You said GSRP?
GSRP, Grade School Readiness Program.
So that's a preschool class?
Yes, it is.
And how old are the students that are in that GSRP or preschool class?
4 years old.
4 years old. Are they?
Did they used to call that preschool?
Did they call it preschool?
I said, did they used to call that?
No, it used to be called something else. I don't recall.
It's like a preschool.
Yes, it is.
Okay, good.
Like familiar or similar to Head Start.
Okay, very good.
GSRP is just a fancy name for it?
It's not exactly Head Start, but it's similar.
All right. And did you know a student by the name of Gabrielle Barrett?
Yes, I did.
And when did Gabrielle Barrett become a student in your classroom?
September, I believe it was, in last year.
Of 2017?
Yes.
And
It
you,
was September, maybe even October.
the beginning of the school year, basically?
Yes.
All right. Did you know Gabrielle Barrett before that time point?
No, I did not.
How often would you have interacted with Gabrielle during that time period?
Oh, every day.
Would you have worked with her every day?
I did. She was in my small group.
Would you say you became very or at least decently familiar with Gabrielle and her habits?
Very familiar.
How would you describe Gabrielle Barrett at school?
She was happy,
How did she, go
but
ahead,
very friendly.
that was my next question. How did she interact with the other students?
Not really any different than the others.
So she was normal or average?
Yes.
And how did she interact with you and the teacher, Miss Schulenberg?
She was very loving, huggy, exceptionally huggy, even to sometimes to people she didn't know.
Did she ever hug the other students?
Not that I recall.
Is that something that's not allowed at school, touching the
Oh,
other
no,
students?
they do hug.
Did you become familiar with her toilet habits of Gabrielle Barrett?
In our classroom, they leave the classroom, well, the bathroom is in the classroom, so whenever they need to go, they just go.
The students just go to the bathroom by
Yes.
themselves? Did Gabrielle Barrett ever have a problem using the bathroom at school?
No, she did not.
All right. Did there come a point where you would make any observations about things that might have been a little out of the normal for Gabrielle Barrett?
Not really. She was just exceptionally friendly to people she didn't know.
What about her appearance?
She was clean, always clean. Clothes were clean.
What about her hair?
Her hair, for the most part, was kept.
Did you know she had lice in her hair?
No, I did not. There was one time I noticed her itching excessively, so I checked it. I tried to check it, and at that point it was very matted up,
Did
so it
you?
was hard to even check it.
When would you say this was occur about, if we started school in September, or y'all start in August now?
We start in September.
Okay, so when would that you noticed around about that it was matted?
That, it wasn't until, I'm gonna say probably December.
Okay, toward the end, like around Christmas
Yes,
break?
yes,
That's when you noticed it was matted?
yes,
But before then, it would be kept?
yes, it was.
Did you ever?
Let me ask this last question.
Sure, go ahead.
When did you officially go for Christmas break?
I believe it was December 23rd.
December 23rd?
Yes,
And that's the last day you all saw that you would have seen the children in your class?
yes, yes.
Okay.
Can I put a number on this? I'll mark this as People's Proposed Exhibit 145. Handing you a document, Proposed 145. Do you recognize that document?
I can see it. Okay, it's our attendance, which I don't generally see an
Well, she
attendance
don't
paper
know what
like
it
this.
Does it help refresh your recollection as to when the last week of school would have been prior to going out for Christmas
She
break?
already testified, she don't need to be refreshed, take that back.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I do see an attendance, okay,
If
sorry.
you don't know something, stop sitting up here guessing.
Okay,
Say, I don't know. and then you can be refreshed. But if you say something, you can't change what you say. Do you understand?
Right, I was having a hard time just seeing it.
Okay, Gary, you just, if you don't know, just say you don't know. Go ahead.
Thank you. Did you have an opportunity to take some photos of Ms. Barrett towards the end?
Well, through the school year, we take pictures of the kids.
I'm going to approach and show you what's been previously marked as People's Proposed Exhibits 121 and 122. Do you recognize those two photographs?
Yes,
Are those photographs that you took?
yes.
Move to the admission of 121 and 122.
No objection.
Do you remember when you took these photographs?
It was sometime right before break was over.
When you say break, you mean?
The Christmas break.
Okay, so right before you went out?
Yes, yes.
I'm going to publish for the jury 121.
I admitted it.
Yes.
All right, go ahead.
That would help if the projector was on. Suppose while that's waiting to boot up there, did you ever notice any injuries on Gabrielle Barrett?
She had a bruise on her cheek.
And do you remember which cheek it was?
I don't recall exactly which one.
Thank you.
Is that bruise visible in this photograph that you took?
Yes. And
It looks like
yeah.
Looks like the prompter's finally warming up here. This is People's 121. This is that photograph that you took in late December, you said?
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
that a yes?
no, ma'am.
Yes, I'm sorry.
And you said you could see a bruise on her face?
Yes, yes.
All right, let's, is that it right there where I have the little box formed around it?
Yes.
All right, let's see if my pointer, I seem to have misplaced my pointer, that's all right. And that looks to be on the left cheek of Gabrielle Barrett?
Yes.
Can you zoom in?
Yes, Judge, I'll zoom in some more.
Can the judges see it?
Yes. Everybody see that just fine?
Yes.
Without telling us what she said, were you able to ask Gabrielle what had happened?
Yes.
And did you have to do anything as a result of seeing this bruise and talking with her?
I didn't. My coworker did.
Okay. And is that part of a policy or procedure that you have at the school, checking out?
It just so happened that she did first.
Okay. So, and that would be the teacher, Ms. Schulenberg?
Yes.
All right. I'll put up 122, which has also been admitted. What's this photograph of?
That's our small group making gingerbread.
This is Gabrielle over here on the right side in the multicolored pants.
Yes.
Do you need a Kleenex thing?
Are we?
Do we have any? You want to take a break?
Oh, good.
Go ahead.
I don't have any further questions at this point, Judge.
Cross-examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. Morning, ma'am.
Good morning.
Could you repeat your name for me? I'm sorry.
Deborah Laurain.
Okay, you're okay right now?
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay. And you stated that you were a co-teacher that worked in the classroom where Gabrielle Barrett was a student, correct?
Yes.
And that was working with her teacher, Teresa Schulenberg?
Yes.
Is that correct? Okay. And in that capacity, you've testified that you had a lot of contact with and you knew Gabrielle Barrett, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And in fact, she was even in a specific small group, so you had a lot of contact.
Yes, I did. Plus, I sat with her at rest time.
Okay, great.
You did what?
I sat with her at rest time,
Okay.
nap time.
And in your interactions, you were asked some questions, and you stated that Gabrielle Barrett appeared to be happy, correct?
Yes,
She was friendly towards you and others, correct?
yes,
And that she would interact normally with her, her classmates, correct?
yes,
Okay. And you had talked about, you were asked about toilet habits, and you stated that there's actually a bathroom right there in the classroom, correct?
yes,
Because we're dealing with 4-year-olds, right?
yes,
And 4-year-olds at times can have issues and accidents and things like that, correct?
yes,
And is it unusual for students to bring changes of clothing or anything like that?
yeah, yes, that they do bring clothes.
Okay. And you were also asked a few questions about Gabrielle Barrett's appearance. And you stated that she always appeared to be in clean clothes, right?
Yes,
And she, except for one exception, which we'll get to, he said that normally her hair was kept, correct?
yes,
Okay. And you were asked about it, you stated that you did notice one occasion where there was some matted hair, right?
more than
Yes or
one.
no?
Yes,
Okay, but you described one that was, you said there was matted hair because you noticed because she was scratching, correct?
yes,
Okay, and that was just before the Christmas break that you stated, is that correct also?
yes.
Okay. I have no further questions, thank you.
Redirect?
Yes, Judge. As it relates to that matted hair, did you do anything about that?
Did I? Yes, I did.
Did you bring a brush in and try to brush her hair for
Hey,
her?
also listen, just redirect. We beyond. I'm not going to no more questions, okay?
Thank you, Judge.
Thank you. Step down. Thank you, Natalie. Okay, one more witness and then we're going to lunch. Let's take a stretch break. Can attorneys attorney.
I'm coming, Judge.
First of all, I whisper. My whispers is like talking regularly, so that's bad. Then we have this microphone, so I'm regular. But listen, I had an opportunity to discuss with the lawyers. And so they told me that they have approximately 4 more witnesses. And tomorrow they have 2, and that's it. So we're moving along very well. I just want you to know, okay? I am not going to be a mean taskmaster. I'm gonna let you all have a restroom break, I'm sorry. So we'll do that, Mr. Rather.
Thank you.
Let's take a 10-minute restroom break, and let's come back. Thank you.
All rise for the jury. All rise.
Thank you, Dave. Let's take a 10-minute recess.